But this morning, we're going to be tackling, are you ready for this? Are you ready? The most difficult parable that Jesus will ever teach. So much so, it is so difficult that, and I'm not building myself up, I'm just saying, it's so difficult that if you pick up 4 commentaries and you read 4 different commentaries written by 4 different authors, maybe even by the same author, it's going to say different things about this particular parable. It is that confusing. And if you have been in the church for a while, do you have any idea what parable I might be referring to? It's somewhere within the 16th chapter of Luke, of course. It's found in Luke. You know which one it is. It's right there. It is the unrighteous steward. It is so difficult, and I promise you, you're going to be like, oh, okay, it's difficult, it's in the Bible. No, we're going to be looking at this, we're going to read through it once, and then we're going to sit here and we're going to scratch our heads and try to figure it out what's going on. I guarantee you, you're going to be like, what? But before we get started, can I ask you a question? Have you ever had this parable taught, and do you remember hearing this from the pulpit one Sunday? Seriously, do you remember hearing Tom, he thinks he does. I'm going to come to the assumption that preachers are scared to preach this text. It's just one of those that can go either way. I'm telling you. I'm serious. You're going to be. So before we get into it, let's open up with a word of prayer. Ask God to bless this time. So let's read it. Let's scratch our heads and figure out what it means. Verse 1. Luke 16, verse 1 through 9. Now he was also saying this to his disciples. There was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called to him and said to him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do, since my master has taken away the management from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I'm going to do, so that when I'm removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes." And he summoned each of his master's debtors, the people who owed the master debt. He began saying to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and write 50. And he said to another, "And how much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, "Take your bill, sit down, write 80. And his master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the sons of this age are more shrewd in the relation to their own kind than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by the means of the wealth of the unrighteous, so that when it fails, they will receive you into eternal dwellings." Anybody got an idea? Because you can knock yourself out. I'll sit down. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? You're just sitting there thinking, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? What does he do right? What does he do wrong? What's the example, Jesus, that you're trying to demonstrate from this parable to where I'm supposed to act in the kingdom of God? What does that mean? What are you talking about? Is their brain feel like mush after reading this now? We've come to parables of Jesus, and they're pretty okay. They're not very difficult, you know. We get some context to them. They're not difficult. And that's what's going to happen. This morning, we're going to look at some context, especially some first century background, which is something I give you, but I mean, a lot of, but it's especially important here, and then we'll try to figure out what it means even more. What's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? You know, that's just my first thought. Let's note first what the offense is in verses 1 and 2. Now he was also saying this to his disciples. There was a rich man who had a manager, and this manager was reported to him as squandering his possessions. And he called to him and he said, "What is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager." Okay, the first thing to note is that the master is so rich, he's got a manager. He's got somebody to do his trading for him, his money handling for him. He squanders his wealth. And get this, he's not thrown in prison. Something very important to remember in first century society. You squander somebody else's money, you go to prison until you can pay that back. But what happens? He doesn't go to prison. Wait a minute. Read the text. What does the servant do? Verses 3 and 4. He said to himself, verses 2. And he called to him and says, what is this I hear about you? Give an accounting of your management, for you can no longer be manager. He's just firing. Oh, holy goodness. He's not throwing him in prison. That's absolutely crazy. We're also looking at this Greek word squandering, for our English word squandering. It's very interesting. It's not what you think it is. It's very cool. Squandering is basically, in the Greek, it means to disperse like chaff. Okay? So if you can imagine, I've got a handful of salt. I don't have a handful of salt, but theoretically, metaphorically, I do. Okay? I got a handful of salt, and you look in it, and you can tell it's salt, right? You see it, it's white. It doesn't look quite as good as sugar, but it looks like salt. And if I were to tell you salt, you're going to think it's salt. Anyway, it's a white, it settles nicely in my hand. The idea for squandering is like if I were to take this handful of salt and throw it up in the air and try to stretch out my hand and allow it to fall back into place. It's going to disperse, so especially like, whoa, you know, and then try to catch it all back again. Am I going to get the same amount of return as if I had it in my hand before? No, I'm not. I'm going to get actually far less. And that's what it means to squander somebody's wealth. You throw it out there, and you don't get very much return for it. A lot of misinvesting, not a lot of good investing. And that is what he's guilty of doing. He deserves to go to jail. So can we assume that the master is acting gracious? He's acting good, right? He's not sending him to prison. He's just saying, you're fired. Okay? Give an account for your managing, because you cannot be manager any longer. Look at verses 3 and 4. He's supposed to go get his books. He's supposed to get an account of his managing. But what does he do instead? Verse 3 and 4. The manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking away my management from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I know what I shall do, so that when I am removed from the management, people will welcome me into their homes. So before he is fired, he acts clever, really clever. And you're going to see in a moment how clever he is. He acts so incredibly clever because he realizes that he can't dig. Okay, he's not strong enough. He's ashamed to beg because he's of noble status. He can't beg. He's going to do something that promotes favor with the people he's going to do it for. It's very, very clever. Here it is. Verses 5 and 7. And he summoned each one of his master's debtors, the people who owed his master debt. And he began saying to the first, how much does my master owe you? Or how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said, take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. And to another he said, how much do you owe? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. Even though he's getting fired, he is still under the master's authority, according to the clients that he's relinquishing their debts for. Does that make sense? He's going to the debt. Mary, how much do you owe? You owe $100? Okay. You know what, take your bill, sit down and write 50. Okay? Just do that for me. You know, what do you owe? Okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to knock some of this off. Okay? It's not the graciousness of me that I'm able to give you this debt, this discount. It's the graciousness of the master. Because that's whose name I'm coming. How much do you owe my master? You know, see what I'm saying? How much do you owe my master? And he reduces the debt by 50% at one, and then by 20% by another. I mean, he drastically reduces this debt. But even though the servant is doing the favor, it is still under the grace and the master, or the grace and the goodness of the master. Okay? Does that make sense? Because we can't really go on anywhere else till we get to this point of understanding this. Here's a better way of saying it. All right, Matt.